Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Process Intelligence, the Secret Sauce to Digital Transformation, presented by Document Imaging Group in partnership with TimelinePI. Quickly, let's go over some housekeeping items. So, you may access the audio portion of the webinar through your computer speakers, or you can dial in by phone. All attendees will be on mute upon joining and for the duration of the webinar. A copy of this presentation is currently available in the Handouts section as a PDF. Also, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A panel at any time during the presentation. We will reserve 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer as many questions as time permits. And finally, you will receive a recording of today's webinar and a follow-up email. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speakers. John Roth is the president of Document Imaging Group, which he founded in July of 2006, and offers over 25 years' experience in document capture, business process automation, and enterprise content management. Scott Opitz is a 30-year veteran of this computer industry and has founded and built companies in the application integration, business process management, and business intelligence spaces. In 2014, he founded TimelinePI and serves as its president and CEO. Alex Deibler has spent the last 10 years plus occupying many roles in the enterprise software and most recently focusing on data analysis and process intelligence. So I'd now like to turn things over to our first speaker, John Roth. John?
Thank you, Monique. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. My name is Jonathan Roth, as Monique just said, and I'm the president of Document Imaging Group. I think that most of you on this webinar know us, but here at DIG, our Document Imaging Group, DIG as we're often referred to, is that our solutions focus on applying automation and providing business process efficiency. And the first thing you need to understand in every aspect of the current business process. Fully understanding that process is a critical and often time-consuming task. When you see how TimelinePI can use transactional data to quickly and easily provide a clear picture of any business process, identify the anomalies, and provide efficient process flow analysis, I think you'll be as excited as I am. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Scott Opitz, the President and CEO of Timeline. And Scott, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So what I'd like to do here is this morning is to kind of take you through some thoughts that we have on how using process intelligence can really advance your efforts in the area of digital transformation. If you think about, all the noise out there around digital transformation, I mean, you pretty much have to be blind, deaf, and or living in a cave to avoid, hearing about it on a daily basis. It's important, though, that when you think about this noise, to realize that most of the noise, though, is focused on companies trying to provide greater access through convenient technologies, that are the favorites of our customers, right? And not to discount this is important. We have to do this. But I think an oftentimes unfortunate side effect of this is that we might overly focus on, checking the technology boxes, as it were. You can kind of imagine the checklist, right? That, I've got the best interactive website, I've got a great IVR technology, I've got an iPhone app, I've got an Android app, and so on. And the challenge with that is that sometimes by looking at that too closely, you kind of miss the fact that another key aspect of digital transformation is understanding what's behind those technologies. And we can understand this, right? Over the last couple decades, each new customer generation has been, dramatically more savvy than their predecessor, right? And, they also have matured in an internet age, which basically makes it normal operating procedure for them to be able to, abandon a disappointing service, frankly, with the click of a mouse or the swipe of a finger. So the stickiness that we've historically associated with customers and kind of the change costs of customers migrating, that's really disappeared, because the newer generation of customers just don't think that way, right? They don't really think in terms of switching costs because that barrier has been lowered so greatly. So while enabling, all these different access points for, omni-channel type access and all of that is extremely important, it's, in our view, only a fairly narrow slice of the digital transformation pie. And in fact, if you listen to the analysts, they pretty much spelled out pretty clearly that failing to go beyond addressing just what we'll call the access problem, will result in organizations falling further behind competition and becoming vulnerable. Now, we believe, and it seems to be bared out by the research, that to gain, a true transformation, we've got to go beyond just the simple public-facing interfaces. We need to aggressively pursue, the process improvements that underlie those interfaces, and where possible, even automate them, right? So that we can have, faster response times and candidly improve some of our expense profiles. And this applies to both public-facing as well as internal processes. And the simple truth is, if we only provide better access for our customers at the interface layer, for both customers and partners, without improving the underlying processes, there might be an actually very ugly unintended consequence, which is that we may be empowering our customers and partners to more rapidly figure out how poorly performing some of those underlying processes really are. So at TimelinePI, we believe that for any organization to realize its full potential, it must be able to understand, analyze, and optimize the processes that really are the life's blood of our organizations. So to illustrate this point, think about the following scenario, right? You're in a car accident. Do you really care why some internal issue at your insurance company is causing you to be on hold too long? Or, we've all experienced that, having to repeat ourselves when we are transferred from one person to the next, and trying to take care of some particular service request. Or that we even have to interact with multiple people for what to us might seem like a very simple task that should be able to be completed in a simple step. Regardless of the industry, I think we can probably all agree that any positive feeling I might have about a company providing a mobile app is going to quickly evaporate if I can't, get some level of optimal support when I actually really need their help. And I'm sure we can all come up with numerous personal examples of where we've experienced this type of disappointment. Anybody who's ever applied for a mortgage or other, complex credit application, had to manage the transfer of retirement accounts, need to track a complex health insurance claim where there might be multiple steps of approval required, has probably had a pretty good chance of seeing great opportunities for improvements. And let's face it, as customers, right, we don't really care about the internal challenges of our vendors, right? We just expect it to work well, and frankly, unfortunately, remember really well when that deviates from that expectation. So even if they, finally get our issue resolved, we aren't assured that we're really going to make that customer, that we're going to be happy, and they can't be sure that we're going to be happy. The simple point is, how we got to where we are is important. So the journey matters. So let's also keep in mind, though, that while we've been talking all my examples here have been focused on kind of a customer-vendor relationship, we've also got a lot of people in our organizations who are dealing with process issues every day. And so the way that these processes impact our people in our organization, really is going to have a lot to do with the effectiveness of how well they perform their tasks as well, and what their internal satisfaction is. So to think about this a little more, we think that from TimelinePI's perspective, in all of these examples that I've talked about, we think that it's all about understanding the underlying process and looking for opportunities to improve it. That's really at the heart of what we're all about. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to introduce my colleague, Alex Deibler. So Alex is going to take you through kind of a quick overview of our technology, kind of how it fits together, a little bit of a description, and then take you into a demonstration where he can actually show you this at work in some real business examples. So Alex, over to you.
All right, thanks, Scott. So I've just got a couple of quick slides that I'm going to go through, which are going to introduce what we're going to see as a part of today's demonstration of TimelinePI. So there's going to be three key pillars that we're going to be discussing during the demonstration, and we'll start with process discovery. And what that really means is the understanding of our as-is state of the business. And now this portion of this exercise really shouldn't be underestimated, because in my experience, many organizations, if they're actually being honest with you, will admit that they really don't have a great feel for how their business processes are being executed from end to end. Okay, so once we have that current state knowledge, we'll move on to the analysis phase. And this is going to be where we'll ask questions of the data using a variety of different apps designed specifically to help us uncover inefficiencies along with the root cause, and also identify risk or exposure in our business processes. And then finally, once we've uncovered all that interesting information, we've implemented change policies to try to mitigate that risk or inefficiency, we'll make sure that we're consistently monitoring and alerting interested parties to ensure that these new standards that have been implemented are always going to be followed. So let's drill in on these three pillars. The first phase, as I mentioned, is discovering our baseline. So once we've successfully uploaded data into the tool, the first logical step is to start to better understand the current state of our business. Okay, so to Scott's earlier point, you simply can't improve what you don't currently understand. And so we can start to do that a number of different ways, oftentimes beginning with our case or timeline analysis. So think of a case analysis as a very detailed, step-by-step look at each and every instance of our business process. Now, whatever process that is that we're monitoring, this level of detail allows us to spot those inefficiencies, compliance risks at a really granular, kind of micro-based level. Now, having each process instance's timeline presented to us in an easy-to-digest manner, what that's going to do is provide the building blocks for all the more complex forms of analysis that we'll touch on. Then from that very micro view of our process, we'll zoom out a bit and begin to start to understand the dominant path through our workflow using our schema analysis. Now, one of the keys here is that we're not requiring any interviews, no questionnaires about how different people believe their portion of the process is being executed. We're simply letting the data that underlies our business processes show us what our most common milestone events are and allow it to point out where bottlenecks may be occurring within that model, among other things. So since we're not limiting ourselves to a happy path or expected workflow, we can show you exactly how each and every process instance was executing using this path or swim lane analysis. This will also include interesting statistics, including cost metrics, and the ability to dig deeper into process inefficiencies or possible risks. So the third phase, or excuse me, once we move from that discovery, we'll move into the analysis phase. So this is where we'll use things like process query or search, time interval analysis, protocols, breakdowns, and I'll get into these in more detail in the demo. And there's many, many more, which will allow us to ask questions of the data, do very quick and powerful hypothesis testing. So if we think there may be a certain scenario occurring within our business, we can easily build out graphical queries to either prove or disprove these hypotheses. So this will also include some pretty specialized forms of analyzing the data, like workflow analysis. Now, this app is specifically geared towards managing large call center operations, or really any type of a queue-based workflow, and will allow us to track the customer interaction throughout their entire journey, regardless of what queue or workflow they're sent to. Now, the third phase is going to be our ensuring compliance, alerting, monitoring. Once we've uncovered those inefficiencies, we've taken the steps to mitigate them, let's make sure we're not backsliding. We're not going back to previous behaviors. So we'll make sure we'll configure alerts to notify us in real time when certain conditions come up in our data. This is going to build accountability into the process and ensure that on a go-forward basis, our processes are running as expected. So included with this monitoring is dynamic dashboarding capabilities for business users who may not want to be doing some of that deep dive analysis that I just mentioned, and they're more comfortable monitoring their processes with something like a business intelligence like dashboard. We can provide a dashboard for them so they can customize, drill into their own unique operational dashboard which relates specifically to their business function. So that's an overview of the 3 pillars we're going to be touching on. Let's jump right into the tool and I'll show you how it works. So one of the concepts behind this demonstration is to show you how simple it is to get started with TimelinePI. Anybody can really show you a nice, shiny, polished demonstration. I'm going to show you how we would get from loading our data into the tool to some interesting insights about a process, I think, relatively quickly. Okay, so starting from scratch. So we'll start by browsing out to a file that's got some events related to this business process. And the use case that we're going to be walking through today is around an insurance claims process and all the different steps that go into processing, for example, a customer's vehicle claim. Okay. So the main data source this would be coming from would probably be an insurance organization's claims management system. And the key here is that we pointed out to our event-related data, and there are 3 fields that are required in order to get started. The first thing we'll want is a timestamp field. That's simply going to tell us when an event has occurred. Next, we'll need an ID field, which allows us to join together all of the events, in this case in a given claim instance, into the same context. So for this example, we'd be using something like a claim number or a claim ID, but it could be a policy ID or a customer ID, any type of unique identifier which signifies what we're looking to track and measure. Now lastly, the third field we'll need is the event name. This is simply going to tell us what happened at that step, the work that was completed. So for this scenario, the first notice of loss was submitted, we had an adjuster assigned, when initial review started, we did a fraud check, and so on. So these are really the only 3 required fields in order to get going. Lastly, we can bring in additional fields, which you may consider to be dimensions. These fields here in purple. These are going to be the ways that we're going to want to slice and dice, break down, filter our data, essentially give more context to our analysis. So for this example, we'll have things like adjuster, the state the claim was issued in, the agent, policy type, claim amount, and so on. Okay. Now it's worth mentioning that these timelines can be assembled from multiple files or sources corresponding to different systems of record. So different events can come from totally separate sources. As long as they contain the same object identifier, the tool will be able to then connect them together and insert the events into their correct corresponding timelines. So this is a simple example of getting data, a simple and manual example of loading data into TimelinePI. Of course, as you move into a production scenario, we would set this up to run in an automated fashion, and we wouldn't necessarily be manually mapping these fields. But I wanted to go through this just for the sake of showing you exactly how that's done and to give you an idea of what's required in order to get started. So we've mapped some columns in a file. What I would do is simply hit load and now allow the tool to begin reconstituting the process based on these events. For this example, I've already loaded the data, so I'm not going to waste our time doing that. But if I had chosen to load it, it would have taken about 90 seconds to load what we have here, which is more than 500,000 events related to these claims. So in that time, it's going to reconstitute the process, build all the models, and create the multiple forms of analysis that we're going to be going through. So once we've successfully got data loaded, we're presented with the overview page. This is going to include, as you can see, quite a few metrics that are going to give us a better understanding about our project and the data that we have uploaded. First thing I'll point your attention to here in the middle, excuse me, almost 550,000 events were loaded from that file and have been mapped into roughly 31,600 timelines, or in this case, a timeline is going to be synonymous with a claim. Now we pulled out 31 different types of events from that data. So I'll just pop that up and give you a look at the full list of all the different events which could have occurred in this claims process, sorted by the most commonly occurring or those associated with the most timelines or number of claims. The only other thing to mention here that I've done prior to this demonstration, other than loading the data, is assign a couple of icons, as you can see, to be used for these events as opposed to the default circle with the number in it. Okay, so as far as configuration goes, I'll just show you. You can use icons we provide, upload your own, simply use coloring. The idea being that these events the critical touch points in this workflow are going to stand out to users as soon as they come into the tool. And you'll see where this makes more sense when we get into the timelines view. So that's all that I've done. Everything else is automatically produced by the technology. Some of the other metrics we've got here. The duration of our process. So on average, it takes us 23 days to close out these claims, but there's a range of anywhere from 6 hours to 15 months that it takes us to process. The number of events in our given claim instances. And we've also got some cost metrics. This is actually brand new in the tool. We're able to input cost data, and for any given event, whether that's based on a fixed cost or how long it took somebody to do a certain task. And we can see based on the cost data that was uploaded for this claims process, the entire population of claims has cost $3 million. And we have an average claim cost of $104 to process. And we'll touch a little bit more on the cost when we get to another application. Now the last one to mention here is our distribution of our first and last event in our claims process. So essentially which events are most commonly both starting and finishing our claims process. And I can actually pop this last event up and give you a full list of, in this case, all the events which have closed out the claims process. And you can see I have a frequency distribution here of all of those. So from here, let's move into the timelines view, and we'll take a look at the actual process paths that the tool has generated. So each of these horizontal lines is a timeline, and it represents a separate claim. And each circle with the icon in it, as you can see, represents an event or a step that happened as a part of that process. Now the length of each one of these timelines is proportionate to the elapsed time. So of course you can see some are going to be, in some cases, far longer than others. And this includes some gaps. So you can see this empty space in between events where essentially no work is happening as a part of these claims. So I can click on any one of these and get much more detail as to what has happened with this specific claim and at what time. So now I'm looking at detail specific to timeline or claim number X essentially. We'll come back to these sub-processes. What this is showing us is the superset of all of the events which have happened as a part of this claim. We can see when first notice of loss happened, when coverage and liability was confirmed, we did a fraud check, and so on. Right? So you can see all the way down until the claim was closed. I've got my associated time gaps that occurred in between these events. I've also got that attribute information that you saw me load on the data upload screen here, the adjuster and the state and all those other fields available as well. Now when I turn back on these sub-processes, these additional columns to the right, the tool is automatically figured out by analyzing specific patterns in this data, which events are most commonly done together or as mutually exclusive steps. So in other words, it automatically detected those which are done as sub or parallel processes, and you can see those things grouped out here together. So I'll just give you a quick example. We would expect every claim is going to have a first notice of loss event along with a coverage confirmation, maybe an adjuster assigned to it. But not every claim is going to have, if we're talking about vehicle claims here, is going to have a personal injury claim associated with it, maybe a rental car issued or total loss with corresponding salvage information. And so you can see those broken out here and grouped together as the sub-processes. Okay, so in the insurance use case, you typically will see events grouped together which correspond to the major categories of this claim: coverage, liability, damages, subrogation, and then salvage where it applies. And so when we think about, in my example, I did, like I mentioned, a simplistic example of pointing to a single file and manually uploading the data. But if we were to be pointing to multiple different systems of record, we'd essentially be piecing together the composite life cycle of this claim throughout the entire process, regardless of the system of record that's responsible for recording the events. And it's worth mentioning here, the engine itself doesn't know anything about insurance or claims processing. All right, so it could just as easily be doing this with underwriting, sales, invoice processing. We have examples where we're tracking patients through a hospital or an ED process. It's totally agnostic to the industry and the use case. Really, the overarching idea is to be able to give users a much better understanding of what's going on in their business process very, very quickly, regardless of the vertical that's being supported. So let's hop out of here. There's a huge amount of variability. This is really a true case management process. After having worked with this data, I can tell you no two of these timelines are actually chronologically identical. So one might ask if there's some sort of way to map a process diagram that's going to generally explain to me how things are working. Okay, and then this is actually a question that a lot of businesses will struggle to answer with the existing technology set. And I think I mentioned it before. It's a big reason why many people can't tell you with a high degree of confidence exactly how their processes are being executed. So let's look at how we can map that most dominant path through our process using the Schema Editor. And we'll create a new one. I'll show you exactly how that's done. So we'll first start by allowing the software to take what it believes to be the most important milestone events. So when I select default milestones, what's happening here is the tool is using advanced statistical analysis, specifically picking which steps are most reliably and commonly occurring at the same point of this workflow. So it looks like it picked out 10 milestone events, which are typically happening at the same point in the workflow. And that's great, but we can always customize this. So I have some of those I'd like to assign. Let's add to the model where claims are being denied, maybe where estimates are being prepared, and if fraud check is happening. So I've added a few more. Let's have it generate the schema for me. So this is showing us that most common schema based on the milestones that I essentially said that I care about. Okay, and the nice thing here is that this is not just a Visio diagram. If I save this, it becomes a monitoring tool. So we can see here that by the thickness of the lines, what number of cases have followed which path relative to others, right? I can mouse over and get an idea of the volume of transitions that have happened one way versus another. Or if I want to break this down by the amount of time being spent, I can change my metric here. And so instead of the number of claims that have gone a certain path, let's see where the majority of time is being spent. Now the thickness of the line represents the average duration of a transition. So we can start to understand where the bulk of the time is being spent in this process. And now a new feature that we've just added is the ability to now visualize our claims as they go through this process. So I'll turn on the animation here, and we'll actually start to see the claims as they're processing. Maybe we'll start to see things kind of back up a little bit as bottlenecks may be occurring, and then obviously as they change color, they're actually aging throughout the process. So this is helpful. We can start to really visually start to pick out where things may be bottlenecking, and if there's something that stands out, I can always click on one of these instances, this kind of little outlier up here, and it's going to drill directly into that claim detail so I can learn a little bit more about exactly what happened there. Okay. So that is the schema and understanding our dominant path and being able to visualize claims and where things may be backing up. Now that we have a much better idea of generally how claims are moving, let's go back and take a look at one of the other discovery. We're still in that discovery phase. One of those other process discovery mechanisms, which highlights the amount of variability in our process. Okay, and that's our path analysis. So maybe this puts this in an easier way to begin analyzing for some. Those interested in Lean, Six Sigma, anybody concerned with continuous improvement oftentimes loves this type of view of the data. What this is a frequency distribution of all the different process paths with the most commonly followed behaviors here to the left. Okay, so I've got my different events in order here along the left, and I've got the number of claims along the top, along with an average duration metric for how long, for example, this path takes versus another. So we can clearly see here when steps are being skipped, done repeatedly, or totally out of order, right? And if I scroll to the right, I get more and more obscure and interesting behaviors. And like I said, you can see exactly how long it takes for each one of these paths, one against another. Now I mentioned we're going to touch a little bit more on these cost metrics. I think that's pretty interesting here. So what I can do is actually change this duration metric and actually get a look at the average cost of each one of these process paths or behaviors. So now I can see exactly how much it's costing us to process claims one way. In this case, it looks like the straight through path, 1,704, but only 5.4% of our entire population, maybe not as much as you might think. It costs us almost $77 a claim, whereas this path, where we're jumping around quite a bit, is a much, much larger number, $130 plus more for us to go this path. Right, so we can get very quantitative about exactly how much it's costing us when we're exhibiting these behaviors. So not only could there be compliance risks that we could spot here or safety issues, but we know exactly how much it's costing us from a cost basis perspective. Okay, now when you do spot something that's of interest here, we can certainly go and drill a bit further in on it. So I'll just say something that stood out the first time I went through this data was this 337 and 311 path specifically, right? In this example, we've skipped the coverage confirmation step altogether. Okay, so in these examples, we skip coverage confirmation, we move downstream to other parts of the process. From the insurance perspective, this would be a huge no-no, a red flag. You should never, ever skip a coverage confirmation and go down and complete subsequent parts of the process. So what I want to do is I want to look at all of our timelines that don't have this activity. So very quickly, I'll look at all of our different paths which have not had a coverage confirmation by setting that filter. And it looks like there's quite a few different variations on us skipping that coverage confirmation step. Okay, now I've set this filter. There's 1,672 claims that exhibited this feature. If I go back to my timelines view, I'm now looking at just those claims that missed coverage confirmation, and I can start to drill in and start to uncover root cause, some of the things that we're going to be getting into with the analysis apps. Right, but that shows you how you can use that path analysis to uncover the weird and sometimes wonderful things that are happening and drill directly into it. And now I'm going to show you how we can uncover some root cause and try to mitigate that from happening in the future. All right, so I'll clear out the filter and we'll start to put our analyst hat on. So now that we understand the general schema, we understand the variability using the path analysis, let's start to ask a couple of questions of the data and drill in a bit further. So now I'm looking at my full data set, my 31,596 claims. When we have this amount of data, it's going to be helpful to use the metrics along the start to get, along the top to start to get a better understanding of what we're working with. There's no way I can really digest or scroll through all 31,000 plus cases. So these metrics are always going to be representative of the set of timelines which we have in the window below, and so you'll see these are going to recalculate, change dynamically as we filter and scope our analysis, just like we did with the path analysis. So right now we're looking at all 31,600 almost. This duration metric stands out a bit. The fact that there's at least one case which took 15 months to complete stands out to me. So let's dig a bit deeper into this. When I click on my duration metric, I'm presented with a histogram which shows me the distribution of all my cases by their duration. So the minimum time to process a claim, 6 hours, the average is 23 days, the maximum is 15 months, right? But this spike towards the left shows me the majority are done in far less than 15 months. Now I can move this slider and adjust this dynamically and start to understand exactly how many claims have been processed, in this case, in under 42 days or 6 weeks. So it looks like 94% of our claims, but there are still 1,942 or 6.1% which are outliers, which are between 42 days and 15 months. Now I want to show you how we can take this a step further and choose to break this histogram down by any one of those different dimensions or attributes that you saw me load. So if I'm concerned that there may be an adjuster who's taking their time with one of these claims, or even maybe a type of claim which is taking abnormally long, I can select my dimensions and choose to break this histogram down by any one of those. So let's check on the adjusters. When I choose to break it down by adjuster, you'll see each one of my adjusters has their own respective duration histogram relative to their book of business, the claims they've been responsible for processing. Now the idea here is to just visually take a look what stands out here a bit, and I can tell you with this data set it's Jim Ricks. Looks a little bit skewed to the right, definitely different than most of the other adjusters. So keep your eye on this 23-day average. Now when I sub in Jim's histogram, it's 2 months on average longer than our general average for Jim to close out a claim. Okay, now at the very least, this tells me I need to go have a conversation with Jim. Is he just getting the difficult, long processing claims? Does he need training? Is it a procedural issue? Just what's going on? If I have a directive to drive down these durations, I would probably want to start by having a conversation with Jim. All right. Now, for now, let's clear out Jim, and we won't pick on him any longer. We'll go back to our general histogram, set my threshold at 42 days, and as an analyst, we're going to want to dig deeper into these 1942 that span longer than 42 days. So let's apply this as a filter. So right now, I'm looking at those 1942 that span longer than 42 days. You can see my cost metrics, all of my metrics have changed. So I can see exactly how much it's costing us. One thing that many insurance organizations are concerned with is this step requiring more information. And what that means is we're having to go back to the customer or third party and request information that we don't have to be able to move the claim forward. Okay, so if we fail to get a certain piece of data or a document, we're then inducing more friction into the process by having to go back to that customer. And then secondarily, it's not always completed in a timely manner. So they may not get us that information in a timely manner. Each time that happens, we could essentially be elongating the claim itself. So let's click on this require more info. Now what I'm shown here is a histogram, which just shows me how commonly this event is occurring as a part of my timeline. So it looks like this requirement for more information could happen anywhere from 0 to 4 times as a part of these claims. Now if I'm really interested in drilling further in on that, I can say, well, let's only look at the ones that have 3 or 4 instances of require more information and apply that as a filter. I won't do that right now. What I want to show you is we can get a bit more quantitative and start to better understand exactly how much time is it costing us each time we have to go back to that customer third party and request information. And we'll look at the time interval app to do that. So when I bring that up, it actually has my settings from earlier, but what it says is we're looking at the delta or the time difference between an event that says we need more information to move this claim forward, and then the ending event is that we flag this as the additional information has been received. So how much time is taking place in between there? Now we can see the minimum to be able to get that data is 5 hours. The average is 4 days, which would be an abnormally long time, I would think, to get a piece of information. And the maximum is 54 days. Right now, to exacerbate that, we saw this could be happening up to 4 times as per timeline. So that would be really, really a long time for a claim to be sitting with no work done to it. All right. Now let's go back, and I told you we want to look at a little bit about root cause, and we can use our breakdown view to try to understand, are there trends in the data? Is there anything that points to where and when these claims are happening, so that we can focus our remediation efforts and make sure that we're driving down these closeout times. So let's use the breakdown app to take a look at that. And it looks like, again, this is picking up my my steps from earlier, but we're choosing to break it down by the states. So is there any kind of trend that shows us what state does a state stand out as having longer running claims? And it's a pretty even distribution here, so really there isn't anything that shows us that a state stands out. Now in regards to that requirement for more information step, the person that's responsible in this insurance use case for getting that data from a customer would be the agent on the claim. So let's choose to break it down by the agent and see if anything stands out. And lo and behold, it does look like something does. So we have a big piece of the pie here. Carrie Ann McDonough is responsible for 39% or 712 of these 1,942 claims. Now, similar to that, the point with Jim Ricks, this leads me to believe I need to go have a conversation with Carrie Ann and start to better understand exactly what's taking so long and why she's handling such a large majority of these long-running claims. And if I wanted to learn a little bit more about specifically what Carrie Ann's been dealing with, I can click on her name, apply her as a filter, and now when I come back to my timelines view, I'm shown just those 712 claims that Carrie Ann was responsible for. Now I can page through them and see if there's anything that stands out as to why it would take so long for these things to be happening. All right. So you saw I set a couple of filters here, my duration filter and my Carrie-Anne filter. I'll just pop those up and show you. Those have been set. If I know that I want to come back and re-monitor this specific filter configuration next week, next month, whatever the case is, I can now save these filters as a set. And that way, you know, as you build out more and more complex filtering conditions, I don't need to make all those clicks over and over again. I save it as a set. I can very easily come back and look at Carrie-Anne's long claims next time I come into the tool. And this also gives us the ability to save a set and then use it as a comparison against another set. So whether it's our full amount of timelines, we can do a side-by-side look at, let's just look at Carrie-Anne's long claims versus Jim's long claims and see what the differences are, how they stack up. Is there some kind of a trend there that allows us to fix that with one swoop, essentially? So let's close this out. I will remove my filters. Let's move on to a different type of analysis, that being query or search. Now this is pretty powerful, I believe. And when you think about a traditional BI or even a Google search, it's going to look for objects by using their current attributes. What's the current state? But what if we need to look at things from more of a historical perspective? And I think you've probably seen as we've gone through the demo, that's really what this tool brings to the table. We can't understand how we should go forward if we don't understand the history of our business processes. So I'll just pose a scenario for you. If somebody were to ask this question, how often is this happening? How often do we have rental cars being issued on claims without any record of a coverage confirmation happening, and then subsequently the claim is denied after we've already incurred the cost of that rental car? All right, so it seems like something in this insurance use case that they would say that should never happen, right? But by using a BI search, you'd have a really difficult, if not impossible, time answering that type of a question. So let's just show you quickly how we would build that out. So I'll define an event, which is our coverage was confirmed, followed by a rental car being issued on the claim, and then subsequently the claim comes back as being denied. Okay, now what's interesting here that we've said is coverage confirmation has not happened. So we have not confirmed coverage, yet we've issued a rental car, and subsequently the claim was denied. So again, I've got this hypothesis. Let's go off and test it. Is it valid? I click search. Actually shows me that 91 claims have exhibited that specific behavior. All right, now the beauty here is these queries don't need to be kind of that simple or trivial. Let's add a few things to it. So let's say once the claim denial notice was sent out, thankfully the claimant decided to come and return the car, right? Great, they brought the car back. But let's say we're only interested when they decided to take their time doing it. So let's say the time gap in between the claim being denied and the car being returned, I'm only interested in those cases where it took longer than 4 days, which would again drive up the cost of this invalid or non-compliant claim to the business. So you see we can build in time very granularly into any of these transitions if we're looking to measure efficiency, SLAs, right? We can base anything based off of time. We can look at honing in on any one of those different attributes that you saw me load, so I can add a specific adjuster or state. I can look at repetitions of an event, so if we had 2 rental cars on a claim, so we can get very detailed in building out these conditions. We've added to this one, the rental car was returned, but it took longer than 4 days. If I search based on that, I get a very quick response again. 44 of those claims actually, our claimants decided to take their time before they brought the cars back. Now, the ability to go off and, as you can see, explore and test these hypotheses that quickly is great. Another aspect of these queries is we can set them up to trigger alerts. So I don't need to be monitoring, babysitting this data all day long. I can build an alert that says when we ever go downstream from coverage confirmation and coverage confirmation has not been done, I want to be notified. I want the interested parties to know about it. Right? Making people aware that these cases are occurring in the data and essentially building another level of accountability into the process. So let's clear this out. We'll move into one more analysis app, that being protocol. So as we get into more specialized forms of asking questions, we can start to look at our protocol analysis. And a good example here I like to bring up is in financial services. When somebody applies for a loan or a consumer mortgage, they have to get certain disclosures and good faith estimates that are required by the government, right, that these things are taken into account. And now these specific documents are mandated and absolutely have to be done in the prescribed way, or you're going to be in violation of federal law, and your loan will eventually be null and void. So likewise, most processes, including that mortgage process, include areas where when we get to a certain point, there are things that absolutely must happen, and then oftentimes within a given time range. So here we have a protocol, and in comparison to a query which says give me all the cases which match my condition, it's a true search mechanism. I build a condition, show me all the things that match it. What protocols allow us to do is to define a set of rules which we expect should always be followed, and will show us the timelines which violate or don't follow that rule. So in other words, it's going to be the inverse of the query in that it shows the timelines which don't match the condition that I've set forth. So I've got a simple salvage protocol that I built here. When a vehicle is confirmed as a total loss, we want to make sure that it's salvaged in a timely manner, because each day that it's sitting on the lot, it's essentially a depreciating asset. So this protocol says we're going to do a number of different events, but once we've confirmed that estimate and approved it, and a vehicle has been confirmed as a total loss, I want to make sure it takes no longer than 10 days before that vehicle has been salvaged. The longer it sits, the more it depreciates. So these are the critical conditions or business logic that we expect has been built into our process, and we want to make sure that they're being followed. And I should mention that just like a query, this protocols can be saved to run as an alert to let us know anytime a protocol was violated. So maybe I want to be notified at 5 days and then again in 8 days, so I can do something about it before we hit this unacceptable 10-day threshold. Now, as opposed to only looking at new data being loaded into the system, we can also use these protocols to look to analyze our historical data. So if I click this Show Violations, here are all the various ways that this protocol was violated and its root cause, right? Because there's, we're not just going to tell you that it was violated, how. There's any number of ways that these things can be violated. There was a step missing. Something happened in the wrong position. There was a violation. Now, one of the major considerations here is that if you see something that may be considered a false positive, or you're just not interested in analyzing it, we don't want to flood somebody with those. We don't want to overload you with protocol violations. It's very easy to just simply hide that from the view, and then next time you come in, we can hone in on the exact violations that we're interested in. And then as you've seen me do, I can click on any one of these violations, apply it as a filter, and drill into the claims that exhibited that specific behavior. Okay, it looks like I have a couple of minutes left. I'll show you one last piece. That'll be our dashboarding capabilities. So we'll move into an example dashboard. So I think I mentioned it in the slides. As the business manager, we may not want to be going in and logging into the tool to do deep analysis, right? That's what our analysts should be doing. But there may be certain company goals or high-level initiatives which I need to monitor, keep my finger on. So we've included this type of a dashboard capability for those users. And as you can see, it's a little bit more familiar and less daunting than the timeline view. Now the charts on this dashboard are totally interactive, such that if I want to, I can click on a slice of the pie or one of the bars and drill directly into the timelines that made up this data set. And then I'll just show you it's very easy to configure this by changing the layout visually and configuring metrics to be able to display and to really customize it and make it fit for each end user themselves. The one thing I do want to stress is that this is not a BI dashboard. We don't purport to be a BI tool by any means. We don't do what BI does, and they really don't do this type of analysis, that the process-related analysis that TimelinePI does. This is purely a way of surfacing up information that's directly related to the kind of analysis that you've seen us go through, all about business process. All right, so that's all that I had that I wanted to show. I guess, Monique, I can send it back to you if there are questions or other things to discuss.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alex. We actually do have a couple of questions here that came in. And the first one is, okay, you show getting data from a file. Can I set up the system so it updates on a regular schedule as my data changes? And if so, how often?
Yeah, no question. That's a good question. maybe I didn't explain it as well as I could have. We absolutely. So the answer is absolutely. We would set it up to run on a scheduled basis. What we would actually work with are a set of data management utilities that we can provide, which will assist customers in connecting into the different myriad of data sources, so you're not necessarily consistently pulling from a CSV file. You can then do data joins, data transformations to help clean up that data and get it into the right format to be able to analyze it in the tool. And then along with that, the data management utility allows you to set up a job to be run on a schedule. So whatever the latency that makes sense for your data, we'd be able to load it. I think we have customers doing something as small as 5-minute time intervals. So every 5 minutes they kick off a job and it loads new data into the system. So really you have a lot of options there as to which data sources you're connecting to and then how often the data is refreshed within the tool. And then I'll just mention each time data is loaded into the tool, we get a fresh batch of data. We scan the data such that if any of those alert conditions are met, we make sure to fire off an email or a text message to notify the interested parties.
Okay. All right, this is another one coming in. Can this tool be used to monitor processes related to mailroom operations or other document capture operations? I think Scott and John, maybe you guys can take a stab at this one.
Yeah, so this is Scott. I'll start. So it's actually a really good example. It's a great fit. If you think about anything that's happening with respect to any type of a process which is initiated by some activity outside an organization, many times that could be the result of or triggered by something inbound through any variety of different channels of communication. And so a mailroom being a very popular one, specifically for if you think about payments and things like that. So you absolutely could use each of the steps as pieces are being logged into the mailroom, as they are getting tagged and go through the scan capture process and then ultimately routed for downstream work. It's the beginning of a very common process flow. So as long as we're able to detect or pick up the transactional events from each of those steps that are happening, we would certainly be able to track it. John, you've got, this is actually more in your bailiwick as far as the mechanics of how those documents are managed and how they then are fed into the the downstream process steps. Maybe you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, I do, and I see the tool being very effective in several different areas within any kind of document-centric process or any business process, really. And it's not only first identifying and applying the tool so that to all the transactional data, the historical data that you have, so that you can first of all understand, as Alex put it so effectively, and that understanding your own business process and all of the different anomalies or different transients that a document or any process can go off on. So I think in first understanding and presenting what the existing business process is and how those documents flow through that business process, but then using other technologies and automation and having this tool monitor any kind of changes that you make so that you can continuously improve upon that process, I think is also extremely effective. So yes, within any kind of document-centric process, this tool can be extremely effective in improving the efficiencies and the flows.
Yeah, I think there's another point here worth making as well. The example we showed you, and as we were talking about it, we were focusing primarily on a set of data that Alex showed you being loaded from a single data source. That, it turns out, is actually a fairly unusual thing when you think about true end-to-end business processes, because different steps in a process oftentimes are actually recorded or transacted on different back-end systems of record. And so this is a great example of something like that as well, where you may be using technology that is actually, receiving the information, logging that the document was received, start the scan capture process. And so there may be a lot of things that are happening there, but they're happening in one technology. But then you're going to begin to work on it, maybe going off and working with an ERP system or a CRM system or a trouble ticket system, depending on the nature of what the document represents. So the ability to see that entire process end to end is a great example of where you would want to pull events from different technologies, but get to see it in this holistic end-to-end view. So, I mean, we did, like I said, we didn't make a big deal out of that, but that's a very strong capability of our technology, is the ability to load up events across multiple systems and be able to provide that true end-to-end view of a process, even if those steps don't all live in one single system that you could conveniently go to. We do that for you.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a couple more. Let's see if we can squeeze them in. We are doing both BPM and RPA projects. Where does this fit with those products?
This is Scott, so I'll address that one. I think it fits very well with them, and so let me qualify that. And again, John, you may have some thoughts on this. When we look at BPM and RPA projects, one of the biggest challenges you have, right, is to understand whether, if it's BPM that and actually those things are very, frankly, well aligned. I actually think that they're much more related in technology than they are different, candidly. But they typically take the approach of saying, all right, I've got some process, right, that I think I could either make more efficient, or I could somehow make more streamlined, more automated, more straight through, something like that. And so in both of those cases, though, the first very important question that needs to be understood is, where am I starting from, right? What's my baseline? How do I, in fact, even identify, not in an anecdotal observation way, but in an actual analytical, fact-based way, where do I have the biggest opportunity for improvement, right? Where could I have the biggest cost savings, the greater streamlining to get more throughput, however you want to measure it. And so I see us very applicable in the early stages of planning both those types of projects to understand the baseline. And then on the other end as well, okay, so now I've implemented and made this investment in BPM and RPA, robotic process automation, of course. But I made an investment in these technologies. I've implemented a project or more, one or more. How do I know that I'm actually achieving the result that was promised by those technologies? And so they're using our monitoring and alerting capability to be able to track and make sure that people are, using it the way it was intended, and that even in the case of something as automated as RPA, that the bots are performing the way that they were expected to perform, and that we can measure exceptions where perhaps they don't handle things well. Again, on both ends of those, I think it's a perfect bookend of that type of thing. I mean, John, I know you do a lot of stuff around RPA as well. Started to do a lot more in the last couple of years. What are you seeing out there?
I agree with everything that you said, and certainly, from an RPA perspective, it is, at the end of the day, it's a process, right? It's a business, it's a transactional process. So understanding that process before designing any type of robotics, and then monitoring and clearly seeing the results, I think it's extremely effective.
Okay, we have time for just one more. Is the TimelinePI tool capable of analyzing data from systems like ServiceNow or Salesforce? Maybe Alex, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's nice. Those are actually two great examples, two widely used applications. And so we actually have built a couple of cloud-to-cloud connectors for those specific applications where we're able to load data directly using the public APIs directly from both Salesforce and ServiceNow into the TimelinePI application and really start to do some unique analysis. And in the Salesforce, from the Salesforce perspective, we're able to track these incidents or tickets that are going through maybe a help desk or a project management scenario, and track all the different tasks, problems, and all the different things, so that all those different sub-processes, we can essentially track the entire ticket journey and take a look at all the different interactions that our different support reps are having with it. And then similarly with the Salesforce example that was brought up, tracking sales opportunities and looking at the variation of, you know, how we update the status and the expected close date of these opportunities, and when we follow one path, how likely are we to close a deal versus another path if we're switching back and forth between expected close dates and things of that nature. We can do some very, very interesting and kind of outside of the box analysis than you'll get from those applications themselves. And not only that, but as I mentioned, we can connect directly in via public APIs to bring the data in with very low latency.
Yeah, Alex, actually, when you first started out there, I think you misused one of the terms. So I think you meant in that first example of the trouble tickets, you were talking about ServiceNow, of course. I think you said Salesforce there by mistake.
Yeah, my mistake. Yep.
But in fact, it's I think maybe a good way to sort of wrap it up is to think about this. Everything you do, I mean, everything out there, and of course we're obsessed with business process, and we admit that. That's what TimelinePI is all about. But everything that you do in business, everything is a process. It could be a simple process, but it's still a multi-step process. And so whether it's tracking, you know, in Salesforce opportunities flowing through all of the demand generation, marketing, sales activities to the conclusion of the sale, or it's a ServiceNow where you're tracking all of the steps in servicing a trouble ticket and all of the associated tasks, or it's, you know, quote to cash, procure to pay, claims processing, patient flow through a hospital. Everything is a process, right? And that's really what we're focused on, is figuring out, you know, new ways to be able to analyze and understand that data and then ultimately monitor it, you know, where the existing tools or systems of record just don't have the facility to do that. And I think probably you all with your backgrounds would appreciate that, you know, what you've seen here as well is not possible with things like business intelligence tools and some of the more conventional tools that are out there. So I think that probably is a great place to wrap it, Monique.
Yes, thanks, Scott. And yeah, we are right on time, if not a minute over. But thank you to our presenters, John Roth, Scott Opix, and Alex Deibler, for a very informative session. Thanks to our attendees for joining us today and for all your questions. As promised, we'll be sending a recording of today's presentation in a follow-up email this week. Thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful day.